We just had, at the time of this filming, it was just a few days ago, there was an incident at a Walmart in Long Island the day after Thanksgiving, where basically people were lining up for a sale, 5 in the morning, and one of the workers there was crushed to death, was actually trampled to death by these shoppers. And when the ambulance arrived or whatever it was to take the poor guy to the morgue or the hospital or wherever they're going to take, they didn't want to get out of the way. They said, we've been waiting here for 5 in the morning. I'm not leaving. So that would be the consumer society at its finest. And oddly enough, exactly to the day 5 years ago, on that day, day after Thanksgiving, the same thing happened at a Walmart in Orlando. It was not a worker, it was a woman who was shopping there. And she wasn't killed, but she was trampled unconscious, and people wouldn't get out of the way for the medics to take her away. So when you get finally to that point, this is what Marcuse was talking about, and the whole idea of one-dimensional man and so on, was this tremendous emptiness again. And so I'm going to buy things to fill that emptiness up. And then we see the religious power of it, because if the medics arrive basically to take the corpse away or the body to the hospital, and you're not going to get out of the way because you're going to save $50 on a DVD player, that suggests something has gone fundamentally wrong.
Everybody's looking restless. Oh, that's an 8-minute countdown! What is going on?
The major story that advertising tells us about human happiness is that the way through happiness is through the consumption of things. That in fact buying something in the marketplace will make you happy. In fact, that's the message of almost every single ad. And it's not often you can say that there is one message that is in the literally millions of ads that are produced every year. But I think that is the message. The message of advertising as a whole is that it's better to buy than not to buy. That in fact the way to become, and that you will be happier as a result of buying than not buying. And I think that idea, in fact, I think is the major force for global social change over the last 50 years.
In the 1920s, business leaders were faced with a dilemma. Overproduction of goods had exceeded demand. Production between 1860 and 1920 had increased by 12 to 14 times, while the population only increased by a factor of 3. There were several ways of solving the problem. One was to reduce working hours and raise wages so that production and consumption reached an equilibrium. This would have led to more leisure time for workers and a higher standard of living. The problem with this solution is that it could have entailed a slight decrease in profits. Corporations are mandated by law to maximize profits on behalf of their shareholders, regardless of social or environmental costs. According to business leaders, there was another problem. John Egerton, president of the National Association of Manufacturers, warned that a shorter work week would undermine the work ethic and potentially foment radicalism. If people had time to stop and think, they might also take the time to rethink their position in life. The emphasis should be put on work, Egerton stated. More work and better work, instead of upon leisure. It seems a harmless enough statement, but what businessmen were advocating was revolutionary. Production would no longer be about satisfying human needs. It would be an end, in and of itself. Rather than a democracy of ideas, or a democracy of mass participation, the United States would become a democracy of material goods. The citizen would be replaced by the consumer.
Look at those goods piled up over there. I'm worried. Here we are. We've got the new machines, and they're doing even better than we expected. They've not only cut production costs, but they've increased output over 50%. But we're not selling this additional product. Inventories are piling up. Now, what are we going to do about it?
It seems to me we've got to change our plan completely. Now that we're increasing production, we've got to put on more pressure, work the territory more intensively.
You mean more advertising?
Yes.
The problem of capitalism is the problem of consumption. And the problem is that after your basic needs have been met, there is no real need for consumption. And so you have to convince people that, in fact, their identities are based upon the consumption of objects for which there is no material need. That's the problem that comes from the expansion of the market. If you look at advertising, it's a very interesting history. In the first period of advertising, we can say right up until about the 1920s, advertising talked about goods themselves. They talked about how they were made, what they did, how well they lasted, etc. It really is a discourse about objects, about what goods did. However, starting around 1920, that changes. And from that period on, advertising doesn't really talk about goods themselves. They talk about the relationship of goods to our needs.
Prominent intellectuals continue to argue that the world's complexity makes democracy impossible. A recent cover story in Time magazine claimed that democracy is in the worst interest of national goals. The modern world is too complex to allow the man or woman in the street to interfere in its management. A man who surely would have agreed was Edward Bernays. Like Lippmann, Bernays served as a propagandist on the Creel Committee, and like Lippmann, he went on to refashion wartime propaganda for peacetime aims. In his classic text Propaganda, Bernays suggested that elites regiment the public mind every bit as much as an army regiments their bodies. Bernays considered mass mind control so crucial that it constituted, in his words, the very essence of the democratic process. Bernays' opportunity to shine arose when a crisis threatened not only the profits of major corporations, but the entire capitalist system. The solution, as theorized by business leaders, would lead to social breakdown, environmental catastrophe, and further alienation between the American people and their government. It would also lead to wealth on a scale never before imagined. Rather than focus on the intrinsic worth of a particular product, Bernays suggested a strategy where products became linked with the unconscious desires of the public. In this manner, there would be virtually no limits to either production or consumption.
Freud's nephew was a man by the name of Bernays, and he's regarded as the father of modern public relations, particularly in the United States. His contribution, if you want to call it that, was to take propaganda techniques that had been developed for military, psychological warfare, national security type issues during World War I, and apply them in a systematic way to commercial issues. One of his best known efforts had to do with encouraging women, to smoke. He would stage beauty pageants, he would stage what would today be called photo ops and that sort of thing, in which smoking by women was portrayed as women's liberation, was portrayed as a way to be free and empowered, is getting addicted to nicotine. The audience, the market, in Bernays' mind, had a clear desire to be free, to be stronger, to be more self-empowered. So women clearly wanted these things. Along comes Bernays in the tobacco industry and says, here is how to have it.
Goods don't make us very happy. Goods are not central to satisfaction. What actually really makes people happy are non-material things. What makes people happy seems to be things connected with sociability. I don't mean to say by that material things have nothing to do with happiness. Poor people are not happy. They don't have access to clean drinking water. They don't have access to food. They don't have access to shelter. So it's not that material things are not connected to happiness. They are to some degree. But once you get past a certain level of comfort, material things simply don't provide us happiness. At the same time, there is this giant propaganda system of advertising that is, again, perpetually telling us that the way to happiness is through objects, the way to happiness is through consumption. What makes people happy are things to do with society, with connection, with personal connection, with autonomy, with relaxation. In fact, when you ask people what it is that makes them happy, goods very rarely come into it. However, the problem is that capitalism has to sell goods. The marketplace provides goods, and therefore what it did was it took the images of the life that people really want, which is a life of meaning, of connection, of sociability, of friendship, of family, of intimacy, of sexuality. Those are the images that it took, and it linked them to objects. And so advertising is both true and false at the same time. If it was simply false, it wouldn't work. But advertising is true to the extent that it reflects our real desires.
As bizarre as it may sound for people who dream of fantastic wealth as a cure for unhappiness, the same holds for the wealthy. Beyond a certain level of material comfort, deprivation is relative.
At the bottom level, sure, it's $5 million to $10 million a year. But once you've got 5 or 10 million, that doesn't seem like enough because you're associated with people who have 15 or 20. And when you get 15 or 20, then it's 50 and 100. And you wind up never feeling as if you have enough. And in fact, people really never even thought of themselves as rich, even when they were colossally rich, because of this phenomenon that psychologists call relative deprivation. They were comparing themselves not with you and me, but with each other in this little world that they'd come to inhabit.
In his book, The Status Seekers, Vance Packard uses the phrase merchants of discontent to describe a deliberate strategy by advertisers of targeting the less affluent with status symbol messages. For someone with little chance of changing their social conditions in life, consumerism offers a quick fix that allows people to feel as though they are climbing the social hierarchy, when in fact, they are standing still. The strategy was particularly evident in mid-century automobile advertising. Studies found the people who lived in housing developments were more likely to park their cars outside of the garage than those who could afford more expensive homes. A typical example is this advertisement from Plymouth. It reads, "We're not wealthy, we just look it." The American way of life would be characterized by a myth which would seem to make political activism unnecessary. In the new democracy of material goods, there were an infinite number of possessions to be purchased by rich and poor alike. There was no need to change institutions because the system was already perfect. It was called the American Dream, and happiness was just one possession away.
I think there's not much difference between assuaging your anxiety by buying things and investing in the American dream. They seem to go hand in hand.
The American Dream is a story about how society works. The American Dream says that if you work hard, you will succeed.